Hello, welcome to another video, and today I'm doing a video that it's a bit of a rehash of one that I did many years ago, where I'm just discussing the value of learning functional movement patterns over just purely strengthening, like in the traditional strength training method. So let's discuss why I do that and then how we do it. Alright, so this video, by the way, is preempting a series of 7 other videos that I'm going to do, which we'll discuss as we go here, but this is like the intro to the following 7 videos that are going to be released after this one. So and all of them are going to explain in more detail the 7 patterns that we're going to go over. But firstly, I want to discuss why movement matters more so than just being stronger. So with every program and with every exercise I show on this YouTube channel or in articles on my website, my number one objective is to improve how a person moves. So whether it's someone wanting to jump higher or run faster, or maybe it's an older adult wanting to improve balance, prevent fall, or maybe I'm just trying to rehabilitate an injury with the knee or the hip or the shoulder or something like that, the objective every time is to improve how they move. So strength is important, but it's of absolutely no use to me if the person continues to move poorly. So movement is everything, and that's why every program you do should be based upon trying to improve that. So I'm going to have a couple of quotes in this video, because I find the quotes really sum things up in a sentence that I probably struggle to explain at times, as do some of the pictures. So these pictures really talk very much to this quote by Gray Cook. But so basically what he's saying is, if the movement's dysfunctional, everything that's built upon that dysfunction will be flawed, compromised, or predisposed to risks, even if they're disguised by acceptable levels of skill or performance. So basically that means, like, you may appear to be quite strong and do certain things, but this poor movement, which is easily identified with someone who knows what they're looking for, will inevitably lead to back pain. All right, if you can do deadlifts like this, you will end up in pain, possibly hip impingement. Never feel strong doing these movements as you possibly could. Other movements you might be quite strong in, but this movement is a real red flag to an upcoming problem that is going to happen at some point. All right, so no matter how strong you get with the leg curl and the hamstrings, or a clam with the glutes, leg press for quads, or whatever you do, that none of that is going to stop your body from becoming injured when you bend over to pick up a box or do manual labor or gardening or something like that. All right, so it's not so much the strength that's the problem, it's the coordination and the positioning of the movement that is. So these are 2 examples here of where you could be really powerful on the leg extension, even really like lift 500 kilos on a leg press, but all it takes to break your back is bending over and pick a box up, because neither of these 2 muscle building exercises will change the software program that you use to bend over to pick things up. The strength that you have in this cannot change that. All right, and I could use hundreds of examples, like a chest press seated thing won't change how you do things standing up, because it's eliminating the fact of stability from your legs. I could go on and on and on, which we'll have a look at more closely in a minute, but you just must understand that it doesn't matter how strong you are, if you move poor, you are going to suffer. So breaking down movement into isolated segments has not reduced our musculoskeletal injuries or made us fitter or leaner. So bicep curls and all these things, and now at times there may be a place for them. But at their objective of using them, if you're using them wisely, is to improve a movement pattern that's dysfunctional. It's not my objective to become good at bicep curls. If I can already do the functional pulling movements correctly, I don't need to waste my time with these things, because they are not going to change things on a bigger scale that the functional patterns can. They are only useful in the rehabilitation programs where I can't complete a functional pattern. All right, so I need to use them at times because the functional pattern is too painful, or simply can't be done. So I have to regress down to something more simpler, and try to build up some reserve or mobility in some regard before I eventually come back to the functional pattern. All right, so another great quote here. This one's from Dr. Vladimir Yanda. the unconscious reaction and speed of contraction are the most important for functional stability, not strength. All right, so that's a really powerful quote to always keep in mind. And if you don't believe me on that, all you have to ask yourself is, how do someone like an NFL running back who maybe could squat 300 kilos or 200 kilos in a gym have more muscle than you could ever dream of, but still blow their ACL out? All right, the strength of their legs did not save them from the poor movement of a non-contact cutting move that just exposes their joint to extreme pain. All right, so the strength of the person is irrelevant if the movement is poor. All right, so functional movement, what does Wikipedia define it as? So, you know, I don't really like Wikipedia for everything or for many things, but I just use this as an example of what they would classify it as. So it's basically an exercise which involves training the body for the activities performed in daily life. And partly that's true, but you could almost argue any exercise could fall into that category. Where I like to look at this is how is the specific patterns that we would use, especially when you go back to infant, like when a toddler learns to stand. How do they, like, they learn to wiggle first, which would be a twisting movement pattern. So that's a pattern of movement. That's not an exercise. That's just something we need in order to live. And then they would learn to kneel and then start to lunge before they could eventually squat. And then they try to bend and eventually try to walk, and that'd be your lunge, your squat, your bending, your gait, and then eventually try to do things with their arms, which are pushing and pulling. Maybe pushing might happen a lot earlier when they're pushing themselves up off the floor. So they're examples of movement patterns. They're not exercises. All right, so we're not coming back to what I mentioned earlier about what's my objective with training. Well, I always explain to people when they're in the gym, if they want to be doing exercises that exceed their requirement in life. So if this is their requirement of life right here on this line, I need to be training at a level that's higher than that. If my level of training is below the level of life, I'm really not doing myself any favor. It means that the minute I walk out of the gym, that the life is much harder than anything I just did inside. And a perfect example is when someone's sitting on machines, or someone's just doing exercises that are floor-based, like what they call core exercises, but they're all lying on the floor. And maybe sometimes it's necessary to do that because they're injured, but if they're not injured, I would argue that their training outside of the gym is much exceeding their life requirement. I see this quite often with older adults and seniors, where they're doing stuff with rubber bands that are a complete waste of time, because that's not helping them to improve their balance and their functional capacity when they leave the gym. Everything they've just done is not going to help them at all, because it hasn't met the requirements of the skills that they're lacking. Also with things like Pilates, I see a lot of people who are non-injured spending all their time just doing Pilates and have no strength requirement in a standing capacity, and yet they're still injured, or they have this real huge weakness within their movement because they never train it. Their Pilates training is actually below life because it's not at a point where it's standing up. All right, so machine training I would rate right down the bottom, the lowest it can get. All right, so always understand the functional training is always going to take you well above life skills, which is a great thing. So what are the patterns that I'm referring to? Well, firstly, what are patterns? So patterns are like a group of movements linked together in a big chunk. So the chunk is really like a motor program, similar to a software program on a computer. So basically these motor programs try to link many movements together all in a blink of an eye, or not even a blink of an eye, it's even quicker than that. So you can complete a specific task without having to think about it. Because if you had to think about doing these movements, you would be exhausted within half an hour of waking up in the morning. All right, so these patterns are created by the brain and the nervous system to save us conscious energy and physical energy. So an example here would be a baseball player. This is an example of a lunge with a rotation, with a push, all thrown in together in one specific pattern. So when you're saying to your brain, I want to throw something, it goes to the program that has throwing. All right, that's combining all of these big movements together into one chunk that it calls throwing. Now it doesn't question if it's good or bad, it just says which one do I know the most. And that's the crucial part here, is that you really want to improve these patterns as best as you can to the most optimal and efficient one that you can store in your spinal cord. All right, so now that you understand what patterns are, the 7 patterns that I often focus on are squat, bend, lunge, push, pull, twist, and gait. These are in the free report. You can get this in the description underneath. That goes into a lot more detail and gives you even programs for improving each one. I'm going to just quickly touch on these, and then in the following next 1 to 2 weeks, I'm going to release some videos that expand upon this with 10 exercises. Understand that there's a lot more than just 10 exercises. I'm just giving you 10 examples of ways that I would try to improve the bend pattern. All of these videos will start from easiest to hardest. All right, so firstly, with the bend pattern, as I mentioned about before, the deadlift, for example, is a perfect example of improving the pattern of bending. So it's called a deadlift, but if in the real world we just call it bending over. And in this case, we're teaching people how to bend over using their hips and using the strength in their legs to lift objects and saving their spine. All right, as opposed to someone who doesn't use their legs and uses only their spine with a poor action of bending. So they may have strong legs, but they just never have a chance to use them because the way that they do it with their functional pattern in their motor program is the faulty, has got a virus in it, more or less. So squatting, whenever we improve a squat, we improve the action of jumping, because jumping's made from squatting. Also deceleration, so learning to break. This is very much a knee-loaded movement. This is very much a hip-loaded movement. So we see a lot of hip and back injuries from this one being poor, a lot of knee injuries from this one being poor. Now in sports, it's obviously for jumping, but for older adults, this is just simply getting in and out of a chair. All right, so hence sit to stand is an exercise often prescribed to older adults. But if they had to preserve their ability to squat much earlier than before their muscles wasted, they would never be in this position where they have knee osteoarthritis and all sorts of problems because the joint wasn't left unstable for so long. It's not bad luck that gave them the osteoarthritis, it's their lack of movement that did. Lunging pattern, again, this is a very athletic one. This one's very much on the move. So, again, this one sort of relates to running. Going upstairs here, you can sort of see it's a similar movement on the go, and there's this sort of toeing off phase from the back leg, a lot of strength being for deceleration for the front leg, very much a good postural movement. Athletically, obviously, that's easy to see that. In terms of just functional for life, if you lose the ability to lunge, you'll lose the ability to get up off the ground. All right, so again, this is another one that predicts falls, because there's a huge stability requirement here, because you really only got your toes on the ground on the back leg. So this one is another really important one for older adults, but just anyone in general. Like you just really, again, a toddler would use this to stand up with. The first time they ever stand up, they'll use a lunge. Moving into upper body things, so with the push, this is where again, this is where the baseball player comes in. Again, this is where the lunge is probably in the last one involved as well. But pushing pattern shares the timing of throwing. Just again, simple everyday tasks that we think nothing of. Maybe we don't need it to the extreme strength of a push-up at times, but I would say that the weakness in this one, I start to see huge issues with shoulders and neck problems. So the real weakness within the serratus anterior, which is really truly developed in pushing strength. And a lot of females have a lot of winging scapular problems, also males, but a lot more in females because they're considerably weaker, a lot less muscle mass to begin with. So weakness in this pushing pattern, I would say, really starts to expose issues at the neck and shoulder. And you can get as many massages as you want and stretch as much as you want, but your underlying problem will be a weakness, and it'll only be solved with developing strength into this pattern around good optimal movement. If you try to develop strength without good optimal movement, you'll end up in a bad place. The opposite of pushing is pulling. Again, like we use this quite a lot, often sort of linked with the bending pattern at times. So, like pulling weeds out of a garden would be one thing I could think of in terms of a sport, tackling and football, rock climbing, all those different things. Grip strength is a huge factor here. So the pulling exercises develop incredible grip strength, and grip strength is an overall factor in terms of overall strength, total strength. It's something that really determines how the whole body will function together. As similar to the shoulder one, the weakness in this one, we start to see the development of poor postural problems through the weakness through the posterior upper body muscles in the upper back area. So dowager's humps, kyphosis, all those sort of things, considerable weakness within this. So whether or not you even needed to have a lot of strength as the time goes by becomes a bigger problem. Twisting, so obvious thing to think of is golf, tennis, and all these rotational sports, baseball again. But again, functionally, we use this one quite a lot. Things like vacuuming, sweeping leaves, doing things, even walking to some degree has an element of rotation in it. So when there's a lack of rotation, we really lose a lot of athletic movement, and joints are subjected to excessive amounts of compression because we basically lose our spring. This one's probably one of the most important patterns of them all, apart from maybe the bending one, and hence these are the two that often produce the most amount of spinal problems when there's dysfunctions around them, and probably the two hardest ones to learn. All right, so this is something that we use a lot and very rarely trained well in the gym. All the other ones like squat and lunges are trained a lot, and push and pull, but this one's often ignored or just trained very poorly. The last one, gait, really simply is just walking. It's a bit of a no-brainer. This one is probably the most complex of them all. Really hard to train to correct if there's a dysfunction. Again, improving this improves like running performance as much as walking, but again prevents falls with older adults. Again, a lot of hip problems we see with this in younger people these days, seeing a lot of hip problems, real dysfunction within the gait. It brings probably into play the foot stability a lot more than some of the other patterns do. A lot of single leg work would relate into this gait pattern. So again, I can see people with incredible strength with two legs, but absolutely terrible on one leg. And this is where we'll see issues within their gait pattern exposed by training this movement. So very important one, no brainer on that one. So I mentioned a few times movement exposes dysfunction. So this is an example where someone might make the conclusion glutes are weak, and they may appear to do what they need to do within a two-leg squat, but as soon as we get them to single leg or split stance, the person's movement just deteriorates immediately. The problem may not necessarily be the glute medius, because if it was, the two-leg versions of the deadlift, for example, or squat where we're needing it to work, should also be weak, but they're not. The weakness is only found in the single leg or the split stance. So the problem is not necessarily their strength, it's the fact that they don't move well with those patterns. So that's where we may need to train them in those patterns to fully restore their motor program. Basically their software is the problem, not the hardware. Other people where these functional patterns sort of develop from, Paul Check is where I first heard this from, and it really made a lot of sense to me. It was the reason I changed from my approach of using the anatomy version of origin and insertion and using machines and thinking that strength was all that someone needed. But also later on I found researchers like Stuart McGill were using this quite a lot in his philosophy with helping back pain, and this is an example where he used this with firefighters. And so you can see here he's bending, squatting, lunging, pushing, pulling, and he did include gait and rotation as well. All right, but he actually did a lot of scientific research with electrodes, as you can see here, analysing this, because firefighters were injured with weaknesses in these patterns of movement. So even though he was specifically treating them for back pain, he was really using the functional movement to predict and correct areas of dysfunction that were causing significant pain in this population or this specific occupation. So over the years I've really come to embrace this fully, and this is where I reverse engineer. This is where I start and I work backwards from it. The question always comes about, can you get really strong from using functional movements compared to the bodybuilding things of bench press and leg press? People tell me you can't lift as much and whatnot, but what I would argue is the strength of the muscles in the squat For example, I've just got a slide here that lists only some of them because I couldn't fit them all on the slide here, but just gives you an idea of how many muscles I'm using in this movement versus, say, a leg extension where I'm just using the quads only. I'm not really training everything I'm just training them in isolation without their synergistic partners some are having to work in roles of like stability, others in eccentric capacity. The squat is just so much more beneficial. I can build strength with all of the areas in the way they're designed, and same with the chin up versus, say, just a bicep curl. I really can improve the strength of the bicep, but in its relationship with its other partners. So I'm improving it relative to the strength of everything else, as opposed to strengthening it without them. That's when you start to see timing problems and muscle imbalances arise from doing too much isolation training. So there's so much more benefit to training in a functional capacity, and that's what we hope to cover in the next week or two with the other videos that I'm going to do. So this was just an intro version to explain what patterns mean if you weren't sure, and I'm going to give you over the coming days some videos that go into each one of these 7 patterns so you become a bit more familiar with what to do. Make sure you check the description underneath the video here, because I'll give you some links to some additional reading if you want to go through this in a bit more detail. Alright, I hope you've enjoyed that video, and we'll see you on the next one.